my name is Ashley Taylor, and this is the first episode in a series of podcasts. In this episode, we are going to be discussing the basic needs deficit amongst college students, specifically prolonged hunger or food insecurity amongst college students. I am joined today by Mike Johnson. He has his undergrad degree in psychology, and he's currently a grad student at BYU. He is doing research right now on the basic needs deficit amongst young people, and we're going to have a good conversation today about food insecurity.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ashley. I'm actually doing research on the basic needs deficit of people under 30, so college students fit right in that category. So excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and ask you a few questions, get your insider opinion. So we're going to start off with, if you could tell me, in your own words, could you describe food insecurity?
Yeah, for sure. So when food insecurity is said around people who might not have heard the term, I like to relate it to hunger, in that hunger is a feeling that we all have felt. I feel it every single day. Hunger is that lack of food where you ate a little while ago, but it's not quite lasting this long. Food insecurity is different from that, though, in that it's not just a prolonged hunger. It's a prolonged not being able to feed yourself when you are hungry. Food insecurity really comes down to when you prioritize other needs above satisfying your hunger.
Yeah, so students that will buy textbooks or skip a few meals so they can make their college tuition payment. That'd be food insecurity. Awesome. Okay, so going on. So many people outside of school don't realize the severity or even existence of hunger, the hunger crisis faced by college students, just simply because they're college students and people don't really think about that. Could you speak about that?
Oh, yeah. The hunger crisis among college students is way, way more common than you'd think. Everyone likes to talk about the starving college student or the hungry college student. And it really comes down to most college students who you'd classify under that hungry college student label are really struggling with more than just hunger. They usually have some level of food insecurity going on in their lives at the moment.
Yeah, it's kind of a morbid saying if you think about it. The starving student is terrible.
Yeah.
Because the last thing you want is the new generation to be starving or putting needs above their basic human needs.
Yeah, and the last thing you'd want is for that to be the norm.
Yeah, that is horrible. So it seems that most people assume that students receive help from their parents. Do you think that this is widely believed to be true? And do you think this is actually true?
I do think that this is a very common misconception because I don't think that it's necessarily true. As a grad student, I can recognize that college really is a full-time job, and in order to do college full-time, there's a lot of a time commitment that students dedicate towards that. But people have to realize that there's a privilege associated with making college your only full-time focus, and not a lot of people know that a majority of students are working at the same time that they are in school. So, having been a student for several years now, going on 7 years, it does come down to if students could study full-time, they would. And so the students that do end up working, which is, again, more than half of them, they're working because they need to.
Yeah. So, yeah, I know we discussed this a little bit before the episode began, but I believe that in my research, I can go ahead and put it up on the screen, but I believe that more than half of grad students are clocking in 20 hours a week of work on top of their school, which is incredible. So for the idea that most people think that these students just aren't working in order to feed themselves, that's just simply not true.
Yeah, the lucky students and grad students, they'll have some sort of part-time job that will count towards their degrees, but not all students are so lucky to have those opportunities, and they need to fill their pockets some other way.
Yeah, and sadly we often see students that are getting everything paid for by their parents, and those people seemingly stand out more than others, which could be the reason why so many people think that college students are just fed grapes as they just go through all their classes, but that's just simply not the
Exactly.
case.
Everyone knows that one guy, but how many of those guys do you really know? And how
Yeah.
many students do you pass by every day who are doing their best to do it on their own?
Yeah, and as we've established, since these students are working, what do you suggest can be done about the widely held idea that this only impacts the students that are lazy or just people that are lazy, being hunger or food insecurity?
I think, I mean, one of the most important things is just that we should all recognize that, in today's day, most students have a job. Most students are doing something in addition to school that just, compounds and takes up a lot of their time. Most students are not receiving help from their parents or family. And, even if they were receiving a little bit of financial help from their loved ones, if these students are attending these, four-year universities and going to school and making that their full-time commitment, how can we consider them lazy even if they are, receiving help on the financial side of things?
Yeah. And there are also a lot of students that even if they don't have a job, they fall into the category of, let's say, student athletes who are not allowed to have a job if they want to continue their position on the team for the college. And I believe that over 50% of students are considered non-traditional, just as the government has done studies and has checked in on students. They're considered non-traditional in the way that they don't tend to go to school and have every penny of it paid for by their parents.
Exactly. I believe the trend is that is becoming less and less common with every passing year.
Yeah, and that information just comes from like FAFSA things and college just finding out that information. Let's move on to programs like food stamps and SNAP. What are your
Speaking
thoughts?
of FAFSA,
On those programs.
I've got a lot of thoughts about these. I'll just real quick summary. I think they're great, but at the same time, they're not always good enough. I feel like, for example, it wasn't until recently that a lot of these programs were made available to some of those who would really benefit from them, like students. Up until a few years ago, in fact, the SNAP benefits were unavailable to students in Utah simply because they were students. And I know this because at a time where I myself would have benefited and otherwise qualified for food stamps and SNAP benefits, because I was a full-time student, I wasn't able to get those for myself. And so luckily I still had, enough financial stability under myself that I didn't starve. I didn't have to drop out of school. I could continue doing what little work I could as well as school on top of it. But I really do feel like, these programs that help focus on getting people nutritious food have benefited in recent years from expanding and recognizing that students are among this group of people who need this benefit the most.
Yeah, and I know that it has become a little bit more inclusive to students as a result of COVID and other similar things, and just because the government is realizing that students need this help, but it is still difficult, and I know that you and I discussed that situation where you were hoping to get a little bit of help with you and your wife. And just to clarify, food stamps is technically an outdated term. It is SNAP now.
Right.
It's being replaced. But that might be a little bit more easy for listeners to comprehend. What are your thoughts on FAFSA?
I think FAFSA is a great program. I think that it's, if anything, it needs to be, expanded to be available to more people. I think that it really, really does help a lot of students who otherwise would not be able to receive an education. And that was really the goal, I think, originally when they created FAFSA. But I think that, it still has some flaws where students that could benefit greatly from them and receive an education still don't have access to those FAFSA benefits.
Yeah.
And for example, one of the main groups of students who can't receive FAFSA benefits are students whose parents make over a certain income every year. Which, when you think about it, like we discussed earlier, a majority of students and more students every year are actually receiving no financial help from their parents whatsoever. So it really is kind of an outdated question on those FAFSA forms to say, oh, hey, well, how much do your parents make? Because that'll determine whether you, who don't see a dime of that money, get this help or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge issue, and we should definitely see some changes in that regard, because every single year there are more and more students that are not receiving help. So let's just move on to COVID. So do you believe that COVID has had an impact on food insecurity from what you've seen?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I couldn't count on my fingers and toes the number of people I know personally who, right around when the pandemic started, found themselves without work for an extended period of time. And these are people who had jobs that they were laid off from, and people who had opportunities that were rescinded, or people who were looking for work and couldn't find anything because of the pandemic situation and the subsequent economic recession. But it really, when you take away people's income and people's means to get themselves food and provide for their other needs, you will always see food insecurity start, and you will always see people who have to make decisions and say, well, I can't eat today because I need this money for something else. And like you mentioned earlier, it's not all in the negative. Because of the pandemic situation, SNAP benefits were expanded, and there's actually a wider pool of people, including college students, who can access those benefits now. So
Yeah. And we actually see currently that post 2019, so right around when that pandemic hit, we see more people facing food insecurity and joblessness now. And those figures that we see for food insecurity and joblessness are close to those represented in the Great Depression, which is kind of gives you an idea for how severe the issue is currently.
yeah,
Yeah, we talk about the Great Depression like it's something so terrible, but we're experiencing
something that
yeah.
we could never see again, but really we're one disaster, one pandemic, one bad thing happening from passing those numbers and reaching a whole new level.
Yeah. So let's talk about resources. What would you suggest people turn to receive relief from food insecurity?
Well, I would definitely. I mean, we've mentioned a couple. We've mentioned SNAP benefits. We've mentioned FAFSA for students. There are also countless food banks across the United States, and many of them are close to college campuses. Lots of universities actually have their own food banks, specifically for students.
Yeah, like the University of Utah.
Yeah, I think you guys have a great food bank there. But yeah, I would say SNAP is a great place to start. Locating food banks near you is a great place to turn, and really looking for those opportunities in those places is an important step in the right direction for those who find themselves suddenly with food insecurity in their lives.
Yeah, because it can really happen to anyone.
And it can happen quickly.
Yeah.
It can come out of nowhere.
What resources would you like to see implemented and introduced to college students?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think that the number of college campuses that don't have food banks are dwindling, but that number needs to go away sooner rather than later. If universities don't have a place for their students to turn when their students are in need, then they're behind the times. Another thing, we already mentioned FAFSA, but if FAFSA were to include more students, then these students would be able to spend their money and resources and time dedicating themselves to taking care of their needs first of all, and then in turn that helps them be better students and make a bigger difference in their community. I also think that there's a lot of things that universities especially can do as far as counseling for students who find themselves in this situation go. Most, if not all, universities in the U.S. have psychological services for students who go through seasonal depression or mental health issues brought on by stress and other aspects of the student life. But these rarely include food insecurity as one of the basic needs of these students that might not being met.
Yeah, and a lot of those issues that they do have counseling for can lead to food insecurity. Let's say someone is facing some seasonal depression, they're not feeling like they can get out of bed, they don't feel the motivation to go do their assignments, they might lose their scholarships. It happens, and it happens to too many people that you probably know and don't even realize just walking around on a college campus. So it really feels like we're not reaching a solution to what is inevitable in this issue.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if you have any final remarks, but if there are university leaders listening to this right now, what would you like to say to them?
I'd just like to remind them that their students will perform better and graduate quicker when their basic needs are met. They'll go on to do bigger and better things sooner when they can, be confident that their basic needs are accounted for. So if university leaders aren't thinking about the well-being of their students with every decision, then that definitely needs to be something that's changed. Students need to be asked if they're struggling sometimes. A lot of them are too prideful or proud to really come forward and just say, hey, I need some help, especially if they feel like they won't be able to find it anywhere. So if university leaders are listening, I'd encourage them to, make sure that their students are being looked after and that they know that they're being looked after.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of universities release studies to their students to see if they are struggling. They take the initiative to reach out to these students and ask if they are struggling with food insecurity or struggling with their school, and they just take a little bit of a they just ask the students how they're doing in many different regards, which is so important because a lot of the times universities may not even realize that many of their students are struggling with this issue. It's easy to turn a blind eye to it, especially if you're a university leader and make lots of money and that's just not a part of your life, and everyone around you is able to get into that university because you work there. And we really just need to look after the well-being of the students, because if you want to play a numbers game and say your students will graduate faster and be more engaged in their learning if they're well fed, that is true, but it's also important to care about students as people. I mean, you want your students to be happy. You don't want to hear that your university has the most depressed kids or the hungriest kids. That's just simply heartbreaking.
Absolutely, yeah. And a lot of these kids, they won't even know that that there are resources out there. They won't even know that someone's out there to give them a lift or a hand or help up until someone mentions it, until it's advertised, until you make sure that the incoming freshmen know where the food pantry is, until all of these things happen to make sure that your students are taken care of.
Awesome. Well said. Thank you so much for meeting with me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Ashley.
Yeah. All right. Well, tune in next time when we are going to continue this discussion, and we thank you so much for listening to us today, and please reach out if you have any questions about food insecurity, and thank you.